Welcome to High Strangeness, where we ask questions and explore all that is strange and unexpected in our reality.
Welcome to High Strangeness. I'm Tony, and this is a place where we talk about all things strange and unexpected in our reality. Merry Christmas and happy holidays to all of you. Now, in this episode today, we're not going to talk about anything strange or unexpected, but, or maybe, if you're not aware of this book and this person and their website, you should be. And so maybe that's the only strange things that we have here, if you're not aware. But for me, sometimes what I want to do is just have a good episode about things I enjoy and have fun about. And so today we're going to talk about Christmas stuff, and I love that. Do you ever wonder why we do the things that we do, either in society or even personally? Well, one of my favorite shows out there is a History Channel show that's called The Whatever Who Made or Built America, which I think you have something on there too, but we'll talk about that. And I love that show because we get a chance to see the genesis or the origins of things that we see in society around us today. Why are they the way they are? What caused them to happen? And today, my guest is Brian Earl. And Brian is a designer, a writer, a podcaster living in Silicon Valley. He's one of those people who puts up the Christmas tree on Halloween. Yeah. And takes it down on Valentine's Day. As a Northeast native, he has experienced dozens of postcard perfect New England Christmases. Brian has performed a version of his podcast, as a live show in and around San Francisco area Bay. He was a speaker at the Christmas Con, which is a Christmas movie fan conference in 2019. Didn't know they had that. That's cool. Oh, yeah. And also at the Podcast Movement, the podcasting industry's largest conference in 2018. He's a frequent guest on many popular Christmas-themed podcasts and other podcasts, and has been mentioned and or interviewed in outlets like Vanity Fair, Modern Woman, USA Today, the Financial Times, Best Life, Bustle, Huffington Post, Pop Sugar, and so on. And so with that, I'm really happy to have Brian on the show here today and excited to talk to him and learn about all he's got going on. So with that, how are you doing, my friend Brian?
I'm doing great, and an early Merry Christmas to you, and thanks for having me on.
Yes, this is great. And you're from California, right? But you were from the East Coast.
Yep, originally Stoughton, Massachusetts, born and raised there, have a large family out there, but came out here in 2015 for work, and then we sort of put down roots and had a child, so we're Californians now.
I hear you. Now, out there in California, how's Christmas? Is it strong and well there in California?
Oh, yeah. And as a matter of fact, we have this fantastic Bay Area tradition called the Great Dickens Christmas Fair. And if you can imagine like a Renaissance festival vibe, but for Victorian London Christmas, it's the same idea. And as a matter of fact, the people who put it on, it's the same family that started the Renaissance festivals back in the 60s. So it's just really immersive. Everyone dresses up like chimney sweeps and carolers, and there's performances, and you can get, just all kinds of hot buttered rum, etc. And so we have a really strong Christmas culture out here. It's different, of course, right? Because there are palm trees in the background, but it's still Christmas.
That's exciting. And is that in the San Francisco Bay Area, or is it different places in California that they do that kind of thing?
Oh, the Dickens Fair is right in the San Francisco. So actually, little town outside of it called Daly City, but it's basically still San Francisco. But we have a lot of other things like up and around, Napa and Sonoma wine country. They have all kinds of, trains that they decorate for Christmas that you can do things. I live in San Jose, where it's more of like a city environment. So we have all kinds of shows, a lot of performing arts centers here in San Jose that'll put on, operas and musicals and things like that. So it's basically like Christmas anywhere, minus the cold weather, of course.
Yeah,
and that was one of the hardest things getting used to when I came out here. You go to Starbucks and they have their holiday cups and the snowflake decals on the window, and it doesn't make any sense, right? Because it's like 65 degrees. So it's it feels a bit of like pretending that it's wintry,
right?
Because I never knew anything else. I grew up in the like classic New England areas where the white steeple Methodist church, like in the middle of town with the snow and the tree lighting ceremonies and all of that kind of thing. And never really not that I didn't realize that Christmas would be different elsewhere, but I'd never experienced it firsthand. So you go to a
Yeah,
place where there's palm trees and you don't need to wear a jacket at Christmas. It took a little while to get used to, but it's its own thing, right? It doesn't feel like it's less than the
right.
experience I grew up with. It's just a different way of experiencing Christmas.
Yeah, I lived for a year in Southern Florida, and it was hard and weird because
Mhm.
I'm originally from the Philadelphia area.
Okay.
So, yeah, it took a little bit to get used to that. It felt weird, but in the end, yeah, Christmas is Christmas, and you can bring it anywhere you want. So, now, Brian, I want to tell you something. Look what I'm sporting right here, man.
I can see the
I
top
got
half of
this.
it. We got
I
an
got
alien wearing a Santa
an
hat.
alien Christmas thingy going
Beautiful.
on. Okay, I wore this specific for the interview
Well, I appreciate
so
that.
that I could be in the spirit. I couldn't find my Santa hat, but it's okay. Well, listen, you've been doing this thing since 2016, right? Like in this space, the podcast and the website, right? Since 2016.
Yeah, it was 2016. I started doing the project in 2015, but 2016
Mm,
was when it finally came out.
that's awesome. And I see, or saw somewhere I saw this, over 2 million downloads. You're the highest rated, most popular Christmas podcast. That's cool. That's
Yeah, I mean, I
amazing.
guess there's no way for me to know how others are doing, but I have little ways of making a guess. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's just been. I never would have expected any of this because, as you know, like podcasters have two basic jobs, right? You make content and then you have to build an audience for it, and they're
Yeah.
separate processes. But the odds are really stacked against you if you put out about a dozen episodes a year over a 6 week period. Like people only care about you for a little while. You have a very narrow window of opportunity. So I never went into this with any expectations at all about
Yeah.
building an audience, about anything. And so for the first 2 years, those low expectations were definitely validated because not much was happening. But then on year three, just things started happening that had me thinking, like, how is this happening?
You're right.
And it's just been growing ever since. I mean, a lot of it is I do put a lot of work into making the best quality content I can and being really good to my audience and trying to find ways to genuinely connect with them and just, all of that. But on the other hand, at a certain point, it just reaches this critical mass and is starting to roll under its own momentum. And I kind of
Mhm.
feel like after I hit those kinds of download numbers, that's when, we'll get into like book deals, TV spots, and all that kind of stuff started coming up.
That's so cool. That's amazing. And I'll tell you, just in my family alone, like I can't wait till they see this episode because I've got daughters and daughter-in-laws that love Christmas like for 6 months out of the year.
Mm.
And when they see this and hear about this, yeah, you're going to have a few more people tying in and looking
Oh,
into
that's
all
great.
that
Thanks.
for sure. It's awesome. Okay. So Christmas past book. So I've read it. I
Oh,
love it. It was really cool. And that's really the reason why I reached out at first, because that's my how I got exposed to you
mhm.
is through the book. And then as in preparation for the interview, I just look at people generally to see what's going on. And I saw an amazing website and the fact that you do a podcast, which I had no idea about. And I'm like, yeah, I want to talk about this for sure. So I'm hoping we can cover some of this
Sure.
later on. I think that's really amazing. Okay. Um, so before we jump into all these things, what I'd like to do first, if it's okay, is I'd like to learn a little bit about you,
Sure.
like what you do, what got you into this space. Clearly, you're a Christmas lover, right? We know that, but like, what what made this happen, or what? How did you feel compelled to do this? All this?
It was really that I was looking for a podcast like the one that I ended up making back in 2015. It was around this time of year. This episode will come out at Christmas, but we're recording it in October.
Hmm.
This is when I start looking forward to Christmas, but I don't want to go all out just yet. And so I said, oh, maybe I'll listen to a Christmas podcast. And most of the podcasts I was listening to at the time were ones that NPR put out, Planet Money, Freakonomics. I was like, wouldn't there be great if there was something like that, but for Christmas? Like NPR does Christmas. This kind of like nerdy deep dive where it's really like, there's this vibe of curiosity and
Yeah.
fascination and this particular brand of storytelling. And I said, okay, I'm just going to search iTunes. It was iTunes back then to look for something like that. And my search came up empty because there were like literally four Christmas podcasts back then.
Wow.
There was a couple that were just like a church putting out their Christmas sermons as a podcast feed, and a couple Christmas music playlist podcasts. And the only one that even came close was one called The Christmas Stocking by this DJ in LA called named Lee Cameron. It's no longer around, but it's still one of the best that ever was.
Hmm.
And what it got me thinking was because his episodes were similar to mine in that they were only about 10 or 15 minutes long. And I had never heard a podcast that was only 10 minutes long before.
Hmm.
And so that gave me the confidence to know that I could do that. But again, like, so I was not thinking of getting into the podcast space.
Yeah.
I was just looking for a podcast. And when I didn't find it, I said, well, I can't be the only one who'd be interested in something like this. So maybe I'll try my hand at doing that myself. And if you've listened to the podcast, I mean, podcasts come in all shapes and sizes. A lot of them are long form interviews like this one.
Hmm.
But mine has a very particular storytelling style where I'll do edits and then do or interviews and then do this extensive editing process where I'm sort of weaving this narrative between me and the person I'm interviewing and then mixing it in with sound effects and music and all of that. It feels very much like composing almost. I mean, not
Yeah.
to be too highfalutin, but that's just what it feels like when I'm actually doing the work. So the problem was immediately, I don't know how to do any of that. Right. I'm a designer. I'm not a journalist. I don't have any sound editing experience. I didn't even have a microphone. I didn't know anything about podcasting. But what I did know was exactly what I thought a podcast like this should feel like when you listen to it. So
Yeah.
I had a vision, and I do have some storytelling skills. I majored in English and was a writer for many years before I transitioned into a design career. So I had a little bit going for me. But that first year, I was just groping around in the dark. I mean, I had
Mm.
no idea. And as I listened to some of my earlier episodes compared to today, it is so clear how I'm imitating the kind of sounds that I wanted to create. Like even the way that I was using my voice, even the way I was using my microphone, where
Hmm.
I had actually spoken with a couple of NPR people. Like I'd reached out to them.
Really?
So Phoebe Judge, who was she has a podcast called Criminal, but before that, she was also just an NPR reporter. And I was really into her show. And I said, well, how do you get that sound? Because it sounds like, you're kind of whispering in my ear.
Yeah.
And she said, no, that's literally what I do. I get very close to the mic. And so you can hear me do like my first, like my cadences and all of that, because like, it was almost like the way that musicians develop their own sound by imitating musicians that they admire first. Right.
Right.
Um, and so, like after a while, I sort of got into my own rhythm and found my own voice and definitely found more efficient ways of cranking out these episodes because, you hear a 10-minute episode, you're like, how long can that take to make? But some of them take like almost 20 hours, like start to
Yeah.
finish,
Yeah.
um, from, like researching the topic to finding because that's another one of the things that I do is I try to find the absolute most undeniably qualified expert to talk about any subject with me. And so sometimes that means like, waking up at 3 a.m. to talk to some professor in Iceland, things like that. So that's a process too. And yeah, we can get into more
Yeah.
nitty gritty stuff if you're interested in that, but that's the story. It was really, I was looking for this kind of nerdy deep dive Christmas podcast, and when I couldn't find one, I decided to make one.
I love that. And I think that's what happens, I think, a lot of times. So I live in the West here, not quite as far as you. I live in Utah.
Mhm.
When I first moved out here, there were some things from the East Coast that I was like, I can't find them. So I started some businesses to bring that to this area because I was like, I need it, right? And I'm not seeing what I want to see. I love that, and that's what needs to happen more and more. People see something in their mind and say, "This is missing out there." So I'm glad you've done this. This is so awesome. I
Yeah,
just wish I would have known about it before. So this is great.
and what it did for me, because again, I'm one of these people who thinks about Christmas all the time. But of course, like I'm married and have you can't, I can't, I'm not allowed to have the Christmas tree up all year. But at
Right.
the same time, it's also true that too much of a good thing kind of spoils it. But I did want some way to stay engaged with Christmas throughout the year.
Yeah.
And so the podcast is given that. Not that it takes a whole year to put out a season's worth of episodes, but I allow it to so that I can sort
Yeah.
of spread it out and just, there's always a little something Christmassy that I'm working on throughout the year.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah, it's funny. I'll reach out to somebody for Halloween stuff in July, and they'll be like, What?"
Oh, yeah.
I'm like, "This is where I want to get this down." Yeah. So that's awesome. Okay, so The Christmas Past. That's the book.
Hmm.
Loved it. Can you give us a light preview? So you've got like what is Christmas, food and drink, characters and entertainment, sounds and sights, and society and culture. Can you just whet people's appetite? Because let's get them ready to buy this book because they
Oh,
need to.
sure.
Yeah.
Well, the book is basically, I mean, not to, not to spoil it or anything. It's basically the podcast in book form. Every
Mm.
one of the chapters in that book was a previously released episode of the podcast. What I realized, I think this was back in what the book came out in 22, so it must have been around 21 when I had hit my first million download mark, and
Mm.
it just sort of felt like I had graduated to another level, and that I was ready
Yeah.
for like whatever comes next. And what comes next for most podcasters is like they put a book out, right? That just seems to
Right.
be like that's what happens when you reach a certain level. So I was able to get an agent, and we put together a proposal, and basically just pitched a publisher that like, yeah, this podcast is kind of a thing, and wouldn't it be great if we could take what works on the podcast, but then also augment that with what works when it comes to books. So like lots of visuals and just breaking things up into little sections and putting in pictures and things like that. Um, and so that's basically the story of how all of that came to be. I took a selection. I mean, I have over, I think it's 225 episodes so far, and they're only
Wow.
how many chapters are in the book? 25. It's supposed to be like an advent calendar, like one for every day of
Yeah.
the Christmas season. So, I took a sampling that I felt like the topics covered a broad range. Like you said, it's broken up into these sections around like different characters or things we eat or things that we
Hmm.
do. And just put together, kind of a sampling of that kind of content. And then there was additional, it's not like literally transcribed episodes of the podcast printed. That would, I wouldn't want something like that.
Right.
So, it was more like that was the starting point. And then we ended up, just coming up with a content strategy for that, did some additional writing, kind of because if you listen to my episodes, again, this is me sort of imitating the NPR style podcast. Um, a lot of the way that I my episodes are scripted, and the way that I write is very much written for the ear. So there's a lot of like, partial sentences or
Mm.
things that are, might sound a little bit more lyrical when you hear them, but if you were to read them on the page, it wouldn't seem like they made any sense. So we did have to start fresh and sort of like write everything from
Yeah.
scratch, but it was really just a matter of translating the content from the podcast into book form.
I love that. I haven't started listening to them yet because we are in October, like you
Mhm.
said. And I read your book a month and a half ago, I think. And so I'm waiting for December because I'm adding this to my list of things to do throughout the whole month of December just to feel it, right?
Mhm.
So I'm excited to hear those and get into that. Um, okay, so there's a couple things like I really loved about the book. There were things that I learned. I mean, like fruitcake.
Mhm.
I always wondered about fruitcake. I'm like, what is this thing, right? So many people hate it, but I knew it came from somewhere. And for you to kind of go into that and going to the history of it, I thought to myself, wow, I love this. It was like, learning the origin of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the common theme for almost any topic that I cover on Christmas Past is, I often say Christmas is the most wonderful time of the year, of course, but it's also the most fascinating because every tradition that you celebrate, there's a story behind it, and it's probably one that you don't know, or you don't know
Yeah.
all of it. Um, or you may have heard things that aren't true. Like I always, my favorite one is that oh, did you know that Christmas trees came from the pagans? It's a pagan tradition. It's like, well, who are the pagans? Like, what are you talking? Like, what tradition is it that we carried over? Like, there's a pardon me, there's a grain of truth in a lot of the things that you think you know about Christmas traditions, but also there's just a lot that you don't know, and that I didn't know either. Like, and so what I try to impart on the podcast is sort of this feeling of like, hey, we're learning this together. Isn't this like absolutely fascinating? Because
Hmm.
some of my favorite discoveries are the ones where there's a hidden connection that you just never would have imagined would influence anything having to do with Christmas. And a lot of those are things that occurred in the late 18th and early 19th century, where there was a rise in things like print publications. The number of daily newspapers in America like tripled over a 2-decade period. And you're like, okay, what does that have to do with Christmas? Well, Christmas was a very regional tradition. Like we were talking earlier about how it's different in California than Massachusetts.
Yeah.
But I still know what Christmas is like in Massachusetts, and how would I, or other places in the world, and how would I know that? Well, because of the media, I can see pictures of it. I can see that in books and magazines and TV. Before all that, there wasn't really a great way to communicate. So, like,
Yeah.
certain communities didn't have Christmas at all. Some of them had it this way or that way. Once you have a print media, you have this way of distributing far and wide this really common understanding of what Christmas is. This really common understanding through publishing things like A Visit from St. Nicholas or Washington Irving's work. We can all agree this is what Santa Claus looks like. This is how he behaves. Did you know, for example, that Santa Claus coming on Christmas Eve is new? He used to come on New Year's Eve for a lot of his
Oh,
existence. He used
wow.
to come in a sleigh pulled by a single horse. Like the 8 reindeer sliding down the chimney on Christmas Eve really mostly comes from Clement Clark Moore's poem, which was published in, was it 1882 in a New York newspaper.
Mhm.
So it's things like that. Like you think, what does the print media, what does the railroads have to do with this?
Yeah.
Because when rail travel became common in the 19th century, all of a sudden you could move a lot of goods long distances. So, the urban experience of Christmas, because a lot of people were migrating to cities for work, but they would miss out on, a lot of the kind of foods that you could have that were coming from the farms. Now, all of a sudden, you could ship goods all over the place. You could ship goods from factories. So, buying things for Christmas that come from factories became a thing. And then even the idea of traveling for Christmas. You think before the rails, in the winter, you didn't really move. The roads
Yeah.
were frozen over. You couldn't get anywhere. So this whole "I'll be home for Christmas" or "Christmas as a time for family homecomings," like that depends on there being transportation, and
Yeah.
that's a 19th century thing. So now think about it: Christmas as a thing that we celebrate on December 25th has been around since the early 4th century. Okay, the Romans decided that that
Mhm.
was what we're gonna have this thing called Christmas. Even then, it wasn't like, oh, this is a feast. It was more just something on the calendar. Like all that
Yeah.
evolved separately. But so we've been celebrating Christmas since then. But Christmas as we know it now, as this thing where we buy lots of gifts and we have a Christmas tree and we travel long distances, that's only since about the 19th century, meaning that 90%, more than 90% of Christmases that ever happened didn't include half of the stuff that
Right.
we recognize now as Christmas. Our ancestors from even, I don't know, 6 generations ago would look at Christmas today and be like, what is this? I barely recognize this. We had Christmas too, but it did not look anything like this.
Yeah.
Um, and so the common thread is that Christmas is just, it's like a river. It's just always moving, constantly evolving. And some things sort of happen over the long term and some things happen over the short term. And so bringing it back to fruitcake, I mean, fruitcake has been a thing since Roman times. It wasn't necessarily closely tied to Christmas for a long time. That was more like a 19th century thing.
Mhm.
Um, and then it was really popular during the 19th century because the Victorians, the way that they added their special touch to it was that they like drowned it in alcohol, like to preserve
Yeah.
that was their thing. Um, and even then, it still wasn't necessarily a Christmas food. They served it at weddings. Queen Victoria served fruitcake at her wedding. But then it became closely associated with Christmas and it enjoyed a very short little life as a popular Christmas food. And then it was like, we can trace it to seriously about the 70s or 80s. All of a sudden, everyone just started hating it. And I grew up thinking that you're supposed to hate it, like just
Me too.
because that's what my mom said and my grandmother said, and everyone, oh, fruitcake is so gross. Um, and then indeed, the first couple fruitcakes I tried were gross because they were,
Yeah.
bought from the grocery store and they had just been sitting in plastic wrap for, a month and a half. Um, but if you have a good one, a real live fruitcake, they are fantastic. I think everyone should try one. There's
Yeah.
there's a famous monastery in Kentucky called Gethsemane Farms. They're like that's their thing is they make fruitcake with Kentucky bourbon injected into
Mm.
it and all that, and it's some of the best fruitcake you can have.
Yeah, I've had one that I actually and I don't remember where it came from. I don't know if somebody made it, but I was like, "This is good."
Do you
So
know
I
who
was
else makes a good one?
surprised.
Excuse me. Um, the Vermont Country Store has one called the Triple Liquor Fruitcake. It's like
Mm.
$50 and it weighs like 25 pounds, but it's this big, right? It's so
Right.
dense.
Dense, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, fruitcake, I think it's not cake, right? It should not have a cakey texture. It's moist and a little bit pasty. I'm not selling it well, but like that's the texture. And boozy. Like it should taste
Yeah.
boozy and fruity if you want the full fruitcake experience.
Yeah. That's cool. Hey, you'd be proud of me for this. Check this out.
Yeah.
This happened just recently at work. Somebody said, I don't even know where it came up, but somebody said, "Man, I heard this weird thing like in Japan they like KFC. And I'm like, I can talk about that.
Yeah.
I said, you know what? And I started explaining it. I said, yeah, you got to go check it. I pitched your book. You got to go check this book out because like I learned that there. And they're like, it's true. I'm like, yeah.
That
So
is
that was so cool.
one of the few examples of, or not few actually, but an example of a Christmas tradition just wholly invented as a marketing scheme. There was no Christmas per se in Japan until the 1970s when KFC, which is wildly popular there, did a promotion saying, oh, make sure that you order in advance for your Christmas order of KFC.
Mhm.
And then they also have for dessert, they have a vanilla cake with 2 layers with the raspberry jelly in the middle, which again, just wholly made up, comes from nowhere.
Yeah.
Not to say that a raspberry jelly cake would be out of place during Christmas, but it's not one of the first things that we think about.
That's funny. Yeah. Yeah. I love stuff like that in your book. And I was just kind of checking through some things here. Loved it. So here's the other thing too. When I was on your website, I think somewhere I saw it said, "Does Christmas spirit include a healthy dose of curiosity?" And I love that because I'm like,
Yeah,
this is it right here. This is it.
that was the idea. I think if you ask someone what they love about Christmas at different points in their life, you're going to get different answers. I mean, obviously, I have a 4-year-old. What is Christmas to him? It's gifts and Santa. As
Mhm.
you get older, it's a little bit about maybe more family or nostalgia. And I just feel like in this last little epoch of my life, I'm 50 years old now, so I've been around a
Mhm.
while. It's really, you have a lifetime of memories of putting up a tree, putting up a wreath, hanging up a stocking, that you start to wonder, like, I've been doing this my whole life, but why? Right?
Right.
Like why? There's a story there. Like it's one of those things that, yeah, you just do and do and do, but never really kind of peel back the onion, as it were. And so it's just been something that had been on my mind for a long time. It's probably what made me back in 2015 go looking for a podcast that was a sort of nerdy deep dive
Mhm.
because I had been reading some really great books about the history of Christmas. The classic is Stephen Nissenbaum's The Battle for Christmas, which is a cultural history of Christmas in America. Anyone who's interested in the topic about Christmas, Christmas history, or stuff like what I do should absolutely read that book. It's
Mhm.
one of the influences for my podcast.
What was the
Or
name again? Sorry.
The Battle for Christmas by Stephen Nissenbaum. It
Perfect.
was actually nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. I mean, it's just wonderful. And then also Jerry Bowler's The World Encyclopedia of Christmas, which is more just like a encyclopedic entries of little short blurbs behind explaining why we do certain things at
Yeah.
Christmas time. So, I had sort of been in that mode for a while of just really being fascinated by Christmas. And I feel like what it does is adds another dimension to your Christmas spirit, right? Like, I,
Mhm.
I think I was perhaps a little worried that it would sort of, it's almost like when you see how a magic trick is done, some part of it you gain a little, right? Like now
Mhm.
you understand, but then you also lose a little because some of the magic is gone, right? And I was
Yeah.
kind of worried that like, digging into Christmas might actually ruin my Christmas spirit. But no, as a matter of fact, it's another layer. And so, yeah, I was really happy when the podcast came out to find out that I'm not the only one who sort of has this appetite for, really exploring the the fascinating side of Christmas, the wonder, the questions, the why do we do this, or isn't that fascinating that that's why we do this?
Yeah. To me personally, it brings value to whatever it is.
Yeah.
This is a silly example, but I remember I've always liked Hershey candy bars, and
Mhm.
then when I learned the history of Hershey, Pennsylvania, and just the whole, the founder, the all that, I thought to myself, every time I grabbed the bar, I was like, "Yeah, Hershey's."
Yeah.
I like knew the history of this thing and the heritage of it. So I love it because, yeah, KFC, like what I even think about KFC, no, but now I'll never forget KFC for this one reason.
Yeah.
So I think it's cool. Um, so before we transition, I want to talk about website podcasts.
Mhm.
Is there anything else you want to say about the book? Thank you for whetting our appetite here. I think people are going to be excited about that.
No, I'm not sure there's much else I would say about the book, except that there's
Yeah.
another book coming. That'll be next year.
Is it
Um,
really? Okay.
yeah, because this one, the first one, like I said, it was just more a compendium of 25 traditions and the stories behind them. There will be a second book like that, I think in 26 or 27. But the book that comes out next year is called Of Christmases Long, Long Ago, and it's about Christmas traditions that we don't celebrate anymore. And remember, like
Mm,
as we were saying before, how the Christmas that we celebrate today with things like White Christmas and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and electric Christmas lights, like most Christmases in history did not include any of that stuff,
Yeah.
right? So the Christmas we celebrated, so it's sort of like this curated set of traditions. And we can't celebrate everything, right? Like it's a collection of traditions that we recognize as Christmas, but it's not the complete collection, and it's not going to be the final version of the collection. It's always changing. And so I really wanted to dig into like, well, what are some things that we used to do that we just don't anymore that people would be
Yeah.
really surprised by? Um, and so it's similar to the first book in that it talks about things that people ate or the way that people celebrate, but you're going to say like, oh wait, we actually used to do that, like that's surprising. Um, so yeah, I think it serves as a nice little contrast to the first book. But no, the
Oh,
first book kind of is what it is. Yeah, it was fun to write, and it was just kind of fun to do all the little things like this, conversations with other
yeah.
podcasters, and to kind of see just who was talking about it once it was out in the ecosystem.
That's awesome. I will tell you this, I'm excited about this next book now because what you've just described is like something totally I want
Yeah,
to know. Yeah,
yeah.
I totally want to. Okay, before we get into podcast and website, there's two things I'd like to get a little information on: Christmas memories and My Dear Santa, a true crime Christmas series.
Oh yeah.
Can you talk about those two things? Because
Oh
I think
sure.
that's interesting.
I can
Yeah.
tackle the first one. It was in my first season. I did an episode about letters to Santa, and I interviewed a woman from the Smithsonian's Postal Museum named Nancy Pope. And she was just basically telling me the history of letters to Santa Claus. And, you know, the idea that he lives at the North Pole is again a new idea, right? That was
Mhm.
sort of influenced by books that mentioned that. Before that, people thought, some people thought he lived in Spain. Some people just would. So anyway, when kids started writing letters to Santa Claus, they would just write random stuff on the envelope, just like the other side of the moon or like in an ice castle. Um, but the thing is, once something is in the mail, it becomes the property of the U.S. Postal Service, and they're just like, we don't know what to do with these letters. Like, we have to do. There's a protocol. We literally have to do something with them. We have to like
Yeah.
try to deliver them somewhere, and if we can't, they end up at the dead letter office. And then if no one comes to claim them, we have to destroy them. But the thing is, what was happening was they were breaking the rules. They were like opening. They're like, these are from kids to Santa. What we're going to do is open them up.
Yeah.
And what it was, and a lot of these letters were just heartbreaking. It was kids being like, can I have a new glass eye? Or like, can you send some food for my sister? Like, just really
Mm.
heartbreaking stuff. And so they actually got this temporary injunction that they were allowed for a short period of time to take these letters. And what they would do is publish them in the newspaper and say, would anybody like to, anyone reading this, would you like to donate? Or would you like to take one of these letters and, like respond to it yourself or deliver some gifts to this family, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so that was going on for a while in the early 20th century. And I'm sorry if you can hear some bouncing up. My 4-year-old's bouncing off the walls. Um, but even so, the postal service was just getting absolutely inundated. So this guy came along saying like, "Oh, I work in the customs office. You know what? I can take all of these off your hands. And I
Hmm.
have this big Rolodex of like working with people in customs. What I will do is set up this whole system of like intake and distribution. I'll get these into the hands of donors, etc." And that was a man named John Gluck. And so Nancy Pope told me this story. Then it
That's
turns out that
amazing.
there was a book written about it by the great nephew of this man, and it's a fascinating story because it's sort of a true crime story where this guy was doing really good work, but then he also kind of got carried away being like, oh, I need donations to fund my operation.
Hmm.
But he kind of didn't. And then he, because this was attracting so much attention, like the Teddy Roosevelt was on their radar, like movie stars were getting involved, etc. He kind of got carried away with all the fortune and fame and
Mm.
self-aggrandizement. And so there was, I'm forgetting the man's name, someone from the city was trying to shut the whole thing down. And it's a fascinating story. It's kind of like this little cat and mouse game between this guy who was like maybe a criminal, maybe not, like really hard to tell whether or not, but like he was definitely shady. He was definitely willing
Yeah.
to blur the lines between right and wrong to do this charity work. So the book was really fascinating. And then I ended up becoming friends with the guy who wrote it. And I said, I think this should be a podcast series.
Yeah.
Um, Possibly the first ever Christmas true crime podcast series. But
Right.
again, it's true crime, kind of like one of those, Miss Marple style murder mysteries, right?
Mhm.
Like no one gets hurt or anything. It's just more like a caper comedy of sorts. So yeah, that came out in, what was that, 2019. It was like a 6 or 7 part series that I did, and interviewed the author and several other just historians and podcasters and authors and things like that. So yeah, that was and that nearly killed me, by the way. Like putting that together was, because I did that in addition to the regular season of the podcast, in addition to having a full-time job. Like that was just such a big undertaking. I'm
Yeah.
not necessarily eager to repeat something of that magnitude, but I'm glad I did it.
Yeah, that's really cool.
The other one was the
Okay,
Christmas memories, which is,
gotcha.
yeah, something I've been doing since the very first episode of the podcast. Is I knew I wanted to tell the story behind a Christmas tradition, but then also end with a listener submitted Christmas memory. So I asked people to
Mm.
record themselves speaking into their phones, voice memo app, like make a little 1 minute recording and send it to me that I include in an episode. Um, and then, the first year I was like begging friends and family to do that so that I had
Yeah.
enough. But then the second year I had so many that I had more memories than I had episodes. So I started putting out compilations, like episodes that were just Christmas memories. And now it's like I have so many, I have to put out many of those throughout the year.
Wow.
Um, and like I love doing the podcast. I love doing the research and the interviewing and the writing and the tinkering. Like all that kind of scratches this creative itch for me. But what
Mhm.
I love the most, I think, is just hearing, because it's that connection, or just hearing, getting glimpses into like other people's lives at Christmas. I
Yeah.
mean, I've heard some fascinating things. I've heard some heartbreaking things. And just some really touching things. Like there was, it's hard to talk about these things without sounding like I'm tooting my own horn, but
Mhm.
I hear a lot of, when people will send me their memories, will also say things like, I've been meaning to send this to you, but it's taken me a while because, like, my husband died last year, and like, Christmas wasn't the same. But then I started listening to your podcast, and it got me back into the spirit, and so I wanted to send you this memory. Um, and it's, on the one hand like really touching, but then on the other hand it sort of makes me feel like this is more than just like my little hobby project right now. Like now I feel more like I have this responsibility to this community that we've all kind of created,
Right.
um but so yeah, I mean, I've even 2 years ago, someone, his mother-in-law was this, they knew that this was going to be their last Christmas,
Mm.
her last Christmas. And he wanted to say like, "Oh, I've appreciated all our Christmases together, blah blah blah," but he wasn't able to say it. So he wrote it down and sent it to me, and asked me to read it as a Christmas memory to share in one of those episodes, because like they all listened to the podcast.
Mm.
So it's taken unexpected turns like that. Like I didn't
Yeah.
expect. I just expected people to send things like, "Oh, like when we were growing up, we'd all wear the same pajamas," but and that's what most of them tend to be. But then they can also just go in very, very different directions.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just been fascinating. And again, we've done like a couple hundred episodes, so I just have this big collection of those.
That really does sound cool. And I could see how that would be really, in a way, rewarding and also very therapeutic for some people out there
Yeah.
to be able to be heard. Because sometimes people need to share something. And that's really cool. So that just happened, huh? It just kind of like rolled out for you and
Yeah.
people. That's a perfect thing right
And
there.
I'm always worried that, sooner or later there's going to come a year where I've gotten all the memories I'm ever going to get, and like I'm tapped out. But nope, every year it just keeps growing. I need to find new ways to accommodate everybody who wants to send one.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks for telling us about those two things.
Sure.
Adding it to my list. Memories. I want to check those out. That is really cool. Okay, your website. There's a lot there. So, what can people find on your website? I did go through it
Yeah.
and saw all the neat things. You have several headings in your podcast area of different categories and all kinds of things. If somebody hits your website, what are they going to find? What can they see there?
Oh, yeah, I'm kind of careful not to oversell the website. It really is just like, that's when you Google Christmas podcasts, I'm usually one of the first ones you'll find. I mean, the
Mhm.
website was really just that, just a repo for all of my past episodes and just a little bit of information about me. Um, every time I get mentioned in the media, I have a page there where I kind of collect all those things. So there's stuff like that too. There was a time when I was trying to turn that more into like a year-round Christmas blog, where
Mhm.
I would have articles and things like the quizzes, the whole thing.
Mm,
It just turned out, like there's really no getting around the idea that people care about Christmas, most people, for about 5 or 6 weeks out of the year. And so to have this kind of year-round thing, it's more trouble than it's worth, honestly. And so I
yeah.
kind of pivoted from that to just having the website be, yeah, just kind of like the permanent web home, the one place that you can always find like updates and things like that. And so even in the news or blog section, I'll put anytime there's something interesting that I've done recently, or I think I just posted something this week announcing the upcoming season. But no, there's nothing super special. I'm glad you like it, but I don't
I
really
do,
find
yeah.
it to be anything very special at all. I actually whipped that up when the book came out. I redesigned all of that and
Mm.
put it up. It's one of the uh, yeah, I'm a software designer in my full-time career, and I still do a little bit of web design and web development. So I can redesign my website whenever I please.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I love so much that, it's people can find things
Yeah,
really nicely, and that's really good. So if you're interested in, you know, the memories and you're interested in some short stories or whatever, you can go and actually find it pretty quickly on your website. I really love that.
yeah. That's
So,
one of the things I did under the episodes was you have little filters, right? Because um, most of the what I consider the core episodes of the podcast are the ones where I tell the backstory behind a Christmas tradition, and
mhm,
those are the ones that, like, those are the NPR style ones with the interviews and the way that I was describing everything. But then I also do other ones where I'll just read an old Christmas story, just like some forgotten piece of Christmas fiction, or share something. Or I used to, I don't have time for it that much since I became a dad. Um, would invite people on. I play like Christmas trivia with them. Though,
mm,
and so, there are many, many different episode formats. And so on
yeah.
the website, what I tried to do is make it easy for you to find, filter out by the backstories or the trivia games or the long form interviews or things like that. So yeah, I'm glad you noticed.
Yeah, totally loved it. It really is good. Um, and just to go to your other point about people being interested for a short period of time, uh, I'm a huge football fan, love it. And when I don't have it for, 4 or 5 months, I really want it. I
Hmm.
can't wait for it when it starts. But every now and then I'll hop in May or something and watch an old football game or something. So I'm glad your website's there. People know it. So if they need a little fill
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
Christmas past, they can hop in all kinds of times
Yeah. And
during
the
the year.
podcast is there year round too.
Yeah. Let's talk about your podcast
Sure.
now. I know you've kind of a little bit, as we've talked, covered some things about it, but people should, I mean, they should jump into this and really look into what you have going on here. So many episodes, so much cool information. Please share.
Yeah, I think I mentioned already. By this point, I have about 225 episodes. Now, again, the ones that I consider the core of the show, um, I put out about a dozen of those a year, and so this coming season will be the ninth. So like whatever 12 times, a bit bad at doing math in my head, but 12 times nine, there's like that many of those style episodes, and then the rest are things like the My Dear Santa special, the like interviews and trivia games and things like that. And what I try to do is the titles of the episodes will say like backstory colon and then the title, or trivia game, things like that. So again, trying to make it easy for you to understand what type of episode it is. Um, but yeah, it's interesting. Around this time of year is when I start looking at my stats again, because I know there's a flat line throughout most of the year. It's interesting. I'll get a little spike in July for Christmas in July, but right around
Mhm.
now is when people start picking up again. So I know people are getting into the Christmas spirit now in early October,
Yeah.
especially a lot of my listeners. We have this concept we call the Burr month, the months ending in BER, which is the last third of the year. But that's, I think a lot of people sort of see that as this sort of extended Christmas season where the main part of it is Thanksgiving to Christmas, but there's kind of like a slow ramp up, starting in September. And I'm here for that. That's cool. But yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything I would say other than that, except that I'm going to kick off this coming season. By the time this episode comes out, we'll already be well into it. I'll
Mm.
start out on Halloween. And something that's really cool that I've been doing over the last several years is I know that your listeners, people who are hearing the audio only, won't be able to see this, but if you're on video, I can show you these books that are put out by a publisher called Biblioasis.
Mm.
Um, they are reviving the idea of telling ghost stories around Christmas time. So that's
Mm,
another one of those things, that people used to do that. We don't really do it anymore, except for Scrooge. That's a ghost story. But ghost stories used to be a big part of Christmas. And Biblioasis starts putting out every year a collection of 3 or 4 just classic ghost stories from the Victorian era. And they're illustrated by this cartoonist that goes by the name of Seth. And they, again, like I fell on their radar and they're like, oh, we're doing this thing. Can we send you these books and maybe you could narrate one of them on your podcast? And so
mm,
that's become a Halloween tradition. That's for the last several years, certainly since my son's been born. That's how we kick off the season.
yeah,
On Halloween, I'll read a ghost story and then I'll do a couple other little bonus episodes between then and Thanksgiving. And then between Thanksgiving and Christmas, that's like for realsies. I'll put out about 3 episodes a week where I'm telling the backstories behind Christmas traditions and doing those Christmas memory compilations. And then every year since the get go, what I do on Christmas Day is put out an episode that is really more like Christmas in review for the year. Like these are the trends, the sights, the sounds, the music that came out, the events from the news, the things that kind of like made this Christmas what it was.
yeah.
So and that's something I sort of write throughout the season and I record like, 2 days before Christmas to make sure I got everything.
Mhm. That's awesome.
Yeah.
You know what? You're going to force me to start listening to some of that stuff around Halloween now. How dare you? But I
Yeah.
love
The cool
it.
thing about the Halloween story is that these aren't Christmas ghost stories. They're just ghost stories meant to be read on Christmas Eve. I mean, that's how
Right.
most Victorian ghost stories are, just ghost stories that
Yeah.
people would tell each other on Christmas Eve, not ghost stories about Christmas. So the cool thing is if you listen to one of those, you can tell yourself that you're not really thinking about Christmas too early because it's just a ghost story.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I just did an interview on a scary Christmas book.
Hmm.
And so that'll come out this month in December. Well, in December.
Cool.
Awesome. So anything new coming for you? So new book
Yep. New
coming up
book.
next year.
In
You already know that something else is happening 2026, 27.
Yeah, so there will be a volume two of the Christmas Past book. So basically, the one that came out in 2022, like that idea, but with 25 new Christmas
Yeah,
traditions covered. Um, and then the one called "Of Christmases Long, Long Ago," which will come out next year.
love that.
And that's just very, very different, like a different kind of content, very different visual style, which I'm glad. I actually got to work. There's going to be 25 original illustrations. I got to work with this great illustrator that I've worked with in the past. So very distinctive visual style. I'm really happy or excited about how this is going to turn out. So
Yeah.
that'll be coming. And then I'm trying to think, other than just that'll be season 10 of the podcast. So I'm going to try to do some just things I've been, meaning to do over these last 10 years. I think I'll save those for next season. But other stuff on the horizon, no. I think when the last book came out, that's when a lot of doors started opening for me. Like that's
Mhm.
when the History Channel reached out and said, "Oh, we'd like to have you on this episode of the Santa Claus." It was the Toys That Built America series, but
Right.
the show was called The Santa Claus That Built America. Um, and when like the book, I was doing interviews for like Time Magazine, Newsweek, New York Daily News. Like it really got a lot of People Magazine. It got quite a bit of exposure. And
Yeah.
so these things tend to have a snowballing effect. I'm thinking when the next book comes out, there might be a bit of compounding of that kind of thing. But
Yeah.
yeah, this is going to be this year, 2024 is just going to be another basic year. There aren't a lot of big, huge, exciting things on tap. Those are all I'm saving for next year, I guess.
That's exciting. Boy, you have a lot coming up, a lot going on, and you have a normal life too. So
I
this is
know.
this is amazing, right? And a little one too. Boy, you're busy.
I am
That's really
busy. Yeah.
cool.
So I'm yeah, full-time job at a large tech company. So I was sort of doing that whole Silicon Valley tech worker kind of thing. And then yeah, like I said, I have a 4-year-old and I'm a 50-year-old man. So there's a whole set of things going on there. Yeah, and then the podcast. So it's a lot to balance, but I love it. I wouldn't do it if it weren't stimulating to me.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're doing it. We need this, and I'm glad you're doing it. So I can't wait to share some of this with everybody. And I know, like I said, I've got a wife that half of the year she goes to bed with the Hallmark Channel watching Christmas shows. So she really, it's her comfort space, right? Like it just makes her feel good about a lot of things, and some of my other kids too.
I will
So
confess, I've made several honest attempts over the years to get into those movies. And I think like I have to pay attention to them because this is what I do is I pay attention to trends and what's behind them
Yeah.
and why. And so on the one hand, they're a fascinating cultural phenomenon.
Hmm.
On the other hand, I just can't get into like I've tried. I put in the work, but they do nothing for me. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and I almost feel like I must be missing something. I want to feel the way that other people feel about those movies because they really get into them, but I just do. There is no center in my brain that is tickled by Hallmark Channel movies.
I'm with you, my friend. Every time I see that on, I'm like, oh. But I love the Christmas thing. I mean, if it, I don't mind it actually being off and just seeing from the side of my eye. I don't want to hear it, but
Yeah,
just the trees and people happy. Love that part, but I'm not interested in the story so much.
yeah,
Sorry,
they're like
ladies who are
wallpaper.
listening, keep doing what you're doing, but I'm not into it. Awesome. Well, as we start wrapping up here, I'm so excited and happy to have had you on. Is there anything else you want to say to my group as they start to be exposed to your group of followers and stuff like that?
Well, depending on when this episode comes out, there still may be time for you to send a Christmas memory to the podcast. And so I just ask people to record themselves speaking into their phone's voice memo app. Keep it short, keep it family friendly, and just
Yeah.
remember to say your name and where you're from so that I can introduce you. And also, just don't do it when you're outside and the wind is blowing. I won't be able to use your episode. I'm not
Mhm.
asking for pristine sound quality, but just don't do it in front of a construction site. I I, I feel bad because I get a lot of those, honestly, or people
Mm,
that sounds like they're trying to eat their microphone as they're recording. And I hate to go back to people and say, I'm sorry, but people are going to listen to this in their headphones. I don't want to like damage anybody's eardrums. Uh,
right,
but so
right.
yes, I'd love to hear your Christmas memory. Just, record it in a quiet place, please. And send it over to me. I'm a Christmas past podcast at gmail.com. That's where you can send things. All my contact information's on my website. I put it at
Perfect.
the end of every episode. I'm very easy to find.
That's awesome. Everybody, starting October, Halloween, moving forward, regular episodes and information coming from Christmas past. So, if you're looking for a Christmas tradition, people, this is a great Christmas tradition. If you're like my wife, like I just said, who is into Christmas 5 months out of the year or more, hey, this is another way to hop in and get your fill and feel. So, a little more about the Christmas spirit in our lives and society. We could use more of it
Mhm.
all the time. Makes people happy, puts people in a good place, and I think we need all of that we can get. And Christmas Past will help you in that endeavor. So, Brian, thank you so much for being on the show. I loved it. I love the information. I love your material and everything that you're doing. Please keep doing that. I know you will. And you have new followers and people of interest, myself and anybody else coming from this, especially my kids and my daughters. Um, let's see here. Well, I think that's probably all that I have for today. Anything you wanted to say in closing?
No, just thanks again for having me on. Merry Christmas to you and your family and your audience. And
Yes.
yeah, again, please send Christmas memories. And yeah, join the Christmas Past family.
Awesome. Please have a wonderful Christmas and holiday season for you, your family, and I hope your little boy enjoys all the neat things he gets for Christmas. And for the rest of you out there, please do the same. And remember, there's a lot of strange and unexpected in our reality. So always keep your eyes, ears, and minds open. And until next time, stay safe.
Thank you for listening to High Strangeness. This was a glance at some of the strange that exists in our reality.